Okay, so I'm going to say welcome to everyone. My name's Alison Gill, I'm your host for today, and I'm joined by Patrick Dunne and by Gillian Karran-Cumberlege from the Chapter Zero. This is our, thanks very much for joining us. I hope I'm welcoming back some people, and also we've got some new people joining us. We've still got a few people joining the call, so I'm just going to hold off for a little bit until we get started in a couple of minutes. Okay, so let's kick off, Patrick. Can I just ask everyone on the call, obviously we'll follow the format that we have done before, which is that Patrick and I are going to talk through some questions we've got about how boards are managing through the pandemic. If you've got questions, we really welcome you to send those questions to us. If you can use the question and answer function rather than the chat function, that would really help us a lot. But please feel free to chat to each other as well via the chat function and make any comments that you want to make. But if you could have the Q&A function to send questions to us, and we'll pick up those questions as we go along. So welcome to Gillian, welcome to Patrick. This week we are continuing with the theme of Build Back Better, which is the phrase that the UN used to focus leadership in recovery from crises in terms of building businesses, homes, environments, communities back better in a more sustainable way from before the crisis. So that obviously the aim is to build back in a way that you're better placed to deal with other crises in the future. So we have invited Patrick, board advisor, Patrick Dunne, takes no introduction, but we've invited Gillian Karran-Cumberlege to join us, who is a steering committee and board member from Chapter Zero, which is the Directors Climate Forum. Before we bring Gillian into the conversation, Patrick and I just thought we'd discuss some of the changes that boards are experiencing since our webinar 2 weeks ago. So Patrick, it seems to me that there are kind of three themes for us to discuss. Obviously, for many businesses, we're now entering the return to work phase. And of course, that comes with a high degree of ambiguity and uncertainty. In lockdown, the message was clear, stay at home. As we return to work, the message is less clear, stay alert, or I think most people seem to have reframed that to stay safe, which is has good meaning, but comes with a high degree of murkiness. I think the second theme around the ambiguity and volatility is that we're starting to see the harsh reality of a looming recession. Businesses are knowing that they need to think about whether they've got to make redundancies, etc. And there are some difficult choices for businesses to make. Thirdly, I think we can't really start this webinar without thinking about the issue of trust. We've seen that sort of concept of trust and mistrust land back on the agenda in terms of leadership and how they are acting, government and how it's acting in the last week. So three kind of important themes. Patrick, what observations do you have?
Well, I suppose just briefly on each of them. So starting with trust, I mean, I think you have to think about what does it mean. So, and for me, it's sort of that it's trust in reliability, dependability, that people will actually do what they say, that sort of thing. It's trust what you're being told, and it's trusting the ability of others. So to me, trust is quite a broad thing. It's not simply about whether, do you trust what that person said or not. It's that sort of trust in type of trust. There's actually quite a lot of research around trust, and there's actually some neuroscience around trust, and the production in our bodies of oxytocin, when we're trusting is a good thing. But one of the things I remember looking at a while ago that was really interesting was that there was a study from Harvard Business School about it sort of ranked companies in terms of the degree of trustworthiness of their employees, and then it actually looked at, is there a link between the level of trust and the level of performance? And what it showed was that the companies that had higher trust had lower stress and higher productivity, lower burnout, and much higher engagement. And I think, I mean, Gillian and I were chatting before the call, I think that also works with suppliers. So, you know, I think the relationships, the trust you have in your suppliers, the trust they have in you, and we talked about in another call, will matter. I think what's interesting as well is that I remember someone explained to me there's this concept of loyalty elastic, that you can kind of pull quite a long way on someone's loyalty elastic, but the moment it snaps, you can't really put it back together again very easily. So I think this is one of these things where we've all seen people's loyalty has been stretched, and we've all been stretched in many different ways. And I think there are a couple of big snapping moments coming, or potentially snapping moments coming. And I think furloughing is worth mentioning. So in the last few days, I think it's becoming clear to companies that it feels like the government's saying that the furlough percentage might fall from 80 to 50 in August. Now, that's not been an announcement, so please don't take it as that. But that's the sort of, the positioning seems to be around that. And if that is the case, then if you're chair of a company, CEO of a company, board of a company, in your June board meeting, which is probably next week or the week after, it's not probably the end of June, you're going to have to be deciding now what is your stance on that. And at the moment, it's still not clear in terms of the demand side for your products in many businesses. You're going to have to be cautious. So I think the announcement we've seen from EasyJet this morning, from others, Rolls-Royce and others in the last few weeks, I think that series of announcements might accelerate, and I think people's level of trust changes when you see colleagues, people in your supply chain starting to be made redundant. Your degree of certainty, your belief in the reliability of your employer and others sort of falls and trust falls. So I think there's going to be a difficult few weeks ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating, hasn't it? Because the response to the crisis largely, I think, has had quite a positive impact on trust metrics. I saw the Enderman Trust Survey published a 62% increase in business leaders and business trust over the last few months, which is, and I've seen other statistics as well, which is an outstanding improvement in trust levels. So I think what we've got to really think about now for boards, CEO and chairman particularly, what are the things that they can do to raise trust levels and to actually keep those trust levels high? Because when things get a bit uncertain and ambiguous, we know that raised level of anxiety in ourselves starts to create a sort of kind of closing down of the people around us who we do trust. So we start to look for reasons psychologically to not trust people, actually, interestingly enough. So what can boards do, Patrick, to think about gaining trust among various different stakeholders?
Yeah, and I see a question's come in on that very point. I mean, the first thing is don't blow it. If you've built up a high degree of trust by being open, being straightforward with people, being measured, having great empathy with them, then now is not the time to switch. And part of the problem is that almost as a coping mechanism, as a defense mechanism, if you're making people redundant, you want to try and depersonalize it if you can. It sort of makes it easier to do, but you can't. So I think that's a very difficult thing. So one of the things that I remember in the financial crisis, when it became clear that Lehman's was failing, I got out a piece of paper and I wrote down morale improvement plan, because I knew that we were going to have to be making quite a lot of people redundant, but also I knew that it would be really tough for the people who were staying, not as tough as for those going, but pretty tough. And so I was deliberate about thinking, what can we do to actually boost morale, in a sensitive, non-rah-rah kind of way, for those people who would be having more work to do, would be, fearful they might be in the second wave and all of that sort of thing. So I think that you can actually be proactive, and you can do things like that. The second thing is really the timing of when you say things is quite important. So some people often say things too early when they haven't really thought it all through. It's generally better to say, this is really serious. We're thinking through this really hard. We want to do everything we can to, protect the organisation, protect jobs, whatever the words that you would use in your setting. We want to do it properly. I think that people will be reasonable about that, much better than you try and put some mask up or some sort of cloud around it, and people just get more suspicious. I mean, most of the people who work for you will know what's going on. I don't know what planet you'd have to be on not to think that there wouldn't be some risk. So I think you just have to be really straightforward. I mean, I thought it's quite interesting watching. I think we need to stay away from politics in these things, but I was really struck by Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand again, and her approach to, they've been fortunate, they've managed things well, they're coming out of it, but there's still a kind of modesty and humility. It's not like, we've won the war, or it's not like that. It's actually quite measured. And I think being calm actually will have a great value at this time. I think, and being measured about what you say and who to and when.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the empathy word, and I think it's been very easy for leaders to feel empathetic and to be humble in the crisis response scenario, because we're all in it together. We can all get ill. We can still all get ill, and that's something that affects all of us. And so that ability to feel the empathy very closely is quite profound, I think. But as we come into an environment where business leaders inevitably have to think about redundancies and reshaping their organisations, there is, I think, a sort of tendency in fear of loss to be defensive and to reverse away from that sort of sense of empathy. And I wonder what other advice you might have, Patrick, around that. What leaders can do to really engage in humility and empathy.
So one of the things that I remember ingrained in my mind, it was a long time ago, but he sadly died now. There was a chief executive of 3i called Hugh Macpherson, and we were, there was a cyclical downturn. We were faced with this, and he gathered together a group of people, and I was one of the sort of the youngsters in this group. He said, I'd actually like you to help me, give me input to decide what I'm going to do. And just the sheer fact that people knew that there'd been, various people from across the world and at different levels had actually, he'd taken the time to sit down with them and get their ideas, and there was some creativity came out of that. So I think, if you're a board, you do have to take these difficult decisions to save the organisation and so on. But you can make people feel that you've gone about it in a way that's been considered and actually taken these into account. So, for example, I see this question come in about, instead of just making people redundant, what about other things like reducing hours and so on? And I think you can have those conversations. It's very hard, though, in very large organisations to do that in a very meaningful way. So, the Rolls-Royce decision, 9,000 people, that's a lot of people. You can have a chat with people, but fundamentally you're going to have to downsize very significantly, whatever, and you can save some jobs at the margins with some creative things. But if you need a fundamental, change to your capacity, that's difficult. But it's back to the classic things of leadership, isn't it? The sort of judgment, interpersonal skills, and your antennae to sort of be in tune with the people that you're dealing with. All the research suggests that generally when people go through redundancies, they get confused between what I call worrying and thinking. So, you know, we all don't like doing this, so we worry about it a lot. But that's not the same as thinking.
Yeah.
You know, worrying is, you know, oh God, this is going to be awful. What am I going to do? And that's a perfectly, you know, important human need to do that. But you more or less need to set your little alarm clock and have a minute's worry, but then have 10 minutes thinking. You know, thinking through is, you know, when should we deal with this? When should we make that decision? How should we do it? What way should we communicate? Who should we involve? And all of those things. And I think times like these lead us, the pressures on us as human beings are to worry rather than think. And I think we need to spend more time thinking.
Okay, so this is there's some good, I think there's some good things, advice coming out here around maintaining a genuine sense of honesty and openness. We've seen an increase in consultation with employees. I think it would be lovely to think that boards can hold hard on that genuine consultation. And then, as you say, really thinking hard about how do we help our employees and organisations to think with us, and to just set aside some of the anxiety which naturally comes with these kind of difficult decisions, but focused on creativity and tangible options, I think is a kind of important.
Yeah. And also I think you have to be careful as well that you don't over consult and appear like you've got no idea what you're doing.
Yeah.
So you need to get this balance right. I mean, you know, having a view, your own view, strong view, this is, you know, but actually having good inputs to that is very different to just sitting in a circle and saying, what does everyone think we should do? You know, otherwise you end up like, you know, what used to be the classic Friday night restaurant choice game. You know, well, I don't mind that, you know, and you're all still standing on the corner and it starts to rain.
Yeah. Okay, so some sort of challenging decisions for boards to take at this time. I'd just like to pause at that point and do a poll question around how much do you think your workforce trusts the board to be making the right decisions at this time? It'd be interesting to get a sense from everybody on the call. So I see that Lesley in the background from governance, who's hosting this webinar, has just put that up, and perhaps if you can make a vote. We'll just see where we are on the trust index with people on the call.
And as panelists are not allowed to vote, by the way.
We have seen some, I was just going to say, I've seen some really good examples of companies dealing with redundancy, really effective. Airbnb announced that they were going to have to make 25% of their workforce redundant, made those 1,900 people redundant with 14 weeks pay, a year's healthcare, job seeking advice, and maintaining some, in some instances, equity stakes. So, you know, that's like quite an unusual offer. Okay, interesting. The poll results have come back there with 70%, sitting somewhat on the cusp. I wonder how different that might have been maybe a week or two ago. I wonder if
staggeringly positive, really, isn't it? Although that sort of sitting on the fence one, you're not quite sure, but that's more positive, which either means we've got a biased sample and everyone's really good at chairing and being on a board, or we're out of touch. Which is hard to know. Yeah.
Okay, so monitoring that kind of trust in the organisation and trust in the organisation's decision making is going to be quite important as we go forward. I know a lot of organisations have really taken to quite regular, using quite regular polling to monitor trust. Patrick, this seems a good point to bring in Gillian to the conversation. Gillian, thank you very much for joining us. There are some real positives, I think, of the coronavirus pandemic in terms of climate change. Environmentally, we've seen the largest fall in CO2 emissions on record this century. I know it's not enough, but it's an interesting start point. Socially, I think we've seen some Herculean efforts with regard to things like keeping the homelessness off the streets, business leaders focused on keeping their employees safe, and governance-wise, boards adding value through repurposing production lines, producing PPE for the NHS for free. You know, some really good news stories, I think, that we've seen. But of course, we come to the hard part now, don't we, in terms of the climate change agenda as the return to work happens. How do we ensure that climate change stays firmly on the corporate agenda? I wonder, just to get us started, what you think we can learn in terms of the response to the pandemic that's useful for boards in thinking about their contribution to ESG and climate change?
Thank you, Ali, and it's a pleasure to be here, and to Patrick as well. I thought I'd start just by giving a little bit of context of the sort of perspective on this, because I think there are some quite interesting parallels between the crisis that we're in now and the much bigger looming crisis. I mean, it sounds odd to hear much bigger crisis, but the implications of climate change are on a different scale. And I think there are some positive signs, and there are definitely, as you suggest, lessons to be learned. And perhaps just to put sort of some context around that, I mean, I'm wearing some different hats, primarily Chapter Zero. And for those who aren't familiar with Chapter Zero, we were set up almost a year ago. We have 800 members now who are predominantly board members, and our purpose is to support, guide and enable non-executive directors to have high quality strategic discussions about climate change in the boardroom, and implicitly to influence that board agenda. We're backed by Cambridge University, and 43 of the FTSE 100 have members, board members who are also members of Chapter Zero. So we both have a broad membership, and we also get to see how different companies are responding. I should also say my background, I've worked extensively in automotive within Volkswagen in a very senior executive role, and I've sat on a Jaguar Land Rover subsidiary board. And so also have seen a sector that's massively impacted by climate change. I sit on the German-British Forum board, so you can see the sort of how Germany's responding, how the UK is responding. And wearing my Fidelio hat, we work internationally with boards on composition and effectiveness. And so across this sort of spectrum of inputs, a couple of observations. One, I think this crisis is very different from the last crisis. I mean, Patrick mentioned 10 years ago and the financial crisis. And I think 10 years ago, everything froze, and pretty much governance and then SRI kind of almost went out of the window. And now we're seeing that a lot of the progress that's been made towards ESG is continuing. Maybe things have been sort of put on pause. Maybe there's a shift from the E to the S, but it's still very, very much prevalent. And I think that's tremendously important. I think also the probably 10 years of focus on governance has helped, and I think this is important for climate change. Secondly, I think there are really important parallels and lessons to be learned. I mean, one is the fragility of the supply chain. I mean, we saw this very clearly in this crisis. You know, there were those moments with the supermarkets that we didn't know the supply chain would hold up. And, you know, if we didn't have enough resilience in this crisis, we clearly won't have enough resilience in a climate change crisis. I think what has been positive, if I look at the work of boards, and I think this is probably reflected in the conversations that you've been having, many boards have been able to focus on the short term, kind of keeping the show on the road and supporting the executive. But we've also seen a lot of evidence that they're continuing to focus on the long term. And one element of that is aligning the climate change objectives to the KPIs and really sort of embedding it in corporate behaviour. For me, that was quite symbolic, that boards were capable through the COVID crisis of continuing to focus on really important sort of climate change initiatives. So I think there are lessons to be learned. We see a lot of evidence that boards are taking this very seriously. there was a lovely quote, I thought, by Emma Howard Boyd, who's chair of the Environment Agency, who said, you know, it's a bit like the suffragettes. During the First World War, they kind of, you know, they stood back a bit, but they didn't give up on the fight, and they continued, you know, picked it up as soon as the First World War finished and got the vote. And I think it's quite a good way of thinking about climate change, that maybe there's a little bit of a pause and other things come to the fore. But a good board will be thinking both in the long term and the short term, and the long term should be learning lessons from the crisis that we're in.
So you sound quite optimistic, Gillian, which is good to hear. And if your experience with your members is that the climate change agenda specifically is staying very much firm and front of mind, could you give us any examples of some things that you've seen that you think are useful for us to useful for people to pay attention to in terms of their own thinking about how to get climate change on the agenda, or to keep it on the agenda at this point?
I mean, I think it's a very varied picture across segments and sectors. And I think also there's some evidence that, you know, some boards are much further ahead and it's much easier. And if you're in the renewable space, it's a very natural discussion to be having. But I think, you know, one thing that we're clearly seeing is that investor pressure hasn't relented. It's continuing. You know, Sasha Sedan's spoken very clearly about not kind of dropping the focus on climate change. And I think, you know, we've also seen other investors talk about climate change competence. So I think that's got a lot of boards thinking about sort of composition and the skills that are needed. I think what we're certainly seeing is in the annual cycle and the strategic review, the majority of companies will absolutely be including climate change and the climate transition, you know, as a major theme. I think the whole shift, you've mentioned ESG several times. I think that's really enabling boards to think in a different way about, you know, not just the primacy of shareholder value, but the primacy of stakeholder value. And I don't think any of us have the answers as to how you calculate that and how you, you know, how you make that transition. But I'd say, you know, the majority of companies in the FTSEs will be giving a great deal of thought to this. And there are some that are, you know, have made substantial progress. I mean, one of the things that we see is, you know, starting TCFD reporting really, it brings business model risk front and center. And I think that's a process that we've seen a number of companies, and you look at the supermarkets, for example, I think, you know, the sort of the work that they've done with stakeholders, with the environment, starting on TCFD reporting, at Tesco, for example, is quite a good place to start to think about this.
Could you just say what TCFD reporting is in case people don't?
Yes, it's looking at the financial disclosure of climate change, and it's really coming out of the Paris Accord. And Mark Carney has been a real sort of, was on the committee that established this and has been a driver. And it's asking companies to look at the impact of different degrees of climate change. And importantly, it gives different scopes, and the broadest scope will include suppliers and effectively the ecosystem. And I think what's going to be important here is we're probably moving towards a mandatory or sort of heavy moral pressure for most companies, and in particular for financial services, so that any company that's lending to, investing in, or insuring a coal-powered business, for example, will have to report that. And I think that's probably one of the, you know, it's a major contribution that Mark Carney has made in his time as governor of the Bank of England. But we've seen that many companies that have been through that process, possibly only for scope 1 and scope 2, are really finding that it's a good mechanism for thinking through business model risk.
Okay, We've had a question come in here, which I'm going to ask you to answer in a moment, but I just wonder if we could have a panel up. Let's see, you're quite optimistic, Gillian, about the boards that you're working with in terms of ESG staying on the agenda. I just wonder about everyone online. If we could have a panel question about what effect has COVID-19 had on your ESG agenda? While that poll's going on, Gillian, perhaps you could pick up this question here around how do we close the gap between small and mid-cap companies' engagement with ESG and what investors are looking for?
I mean, I think that's quite a big question, really. It's you know, probably a broader question than just ESG. I mean, I think ESG is not just about resource. I completely understand where this question's coming from. I mean, if you look at a sort of a kind of a best-in-class company like Unilever, the extent of the sort of the resource and the thinking behind it is almost overwhelming. But I think you know, one of the things, and I guess this is what TCFD is also encouraging boards to think about, is just being, you know, having had the discussion in the boardroom, being clear about what the risks are, being clear about what the priorities are, and articulating that. I mean, then there's work to be done, and there is heavy lifting without a doubt. But I think smaller companies can also achieve that without the enormous resource that a sort of a FTSE 5 company will be able to put into it.
So what you're really saying is there's a requirement really for all boards to be thinking about, to be asking themselves the question, you know, on all these fronts, so environmental, social and governance, what are the things that we can do to contribute, and the reporting process can help in pushing that sort of requirement to do that along. But actually it's about really the deep thinking that's required to take your own stance within your own sector, and to collaborate across sectors, I guess, and different sizes of organisations. So the poll results come through, and here we've you know, got about a third really. So quite varied on the call. Perhaps not so surprisingly, because different.
But less than a third have pushed it to the side, which I think is probably
very good.
If you look back 10 years and the equivalent of SRI, you know, it would have been a much smaller percentage that would still be focusing on the longer term issues. So I think there is a change afoot.
I think also that actually a lot of the innovation has come in the smaller companies around you know, good environmental practice, and I mean, there's been a lot of interesting things happening around that. So I think it's tempting to think that you need the big resources and it's easier for the big companies, but actually, I mean, I think I've been really surprised looking at some of the private equity firms I work with, some of their portfolio companies, the things they're doing. So there was something I was doing with Mercia the other week, and some of the companies there are doing some really interesting things, you know, pre-COVID, and just carrying on.
Yeah, and I guess some of the sort of move to working from home, digitization generally, possibly much more deglobalization is going to help a lot with the climate change agenda anyway. One of the things that I find when I'm working with boards at the moment is that a lot of them have got ESG as a competence on their skills matrix for board members, but I found very few board members yet who are prepared to say that they have a strength particularly in that area, except for unless you're working perhaps with some of the big oil, energy, mining conglomerates. I don't know, what can Chapter Zero do to help with that, Gillian? And what are you observing?
Well, I think I mean, it's a very good point, because you are seeing investors are now beginning to articulate climate change competence without there really being a sort of an agreed definition of what climate change competence is. And I would agree that board companies that have an obvious environmental impact will typically have technical experts in the boardroom, quite rightly, who will have probably sort of scientific engineering backgrounds. And you mentioned mining, extractions, oil and gas, automotive, Interestingly, also utilities, the water companies will very often have somebody who has a very strong sort of environmental focus. But I think, rather like with digital, the argument of Chapter Zero would be this is a responsibility of every board member. And one of the points I think I would just like to add to our previous conversation is it's really important that the board is also engaged in the ESG and in particular the environmental stance of the company. Not that it's entirely owned by the executive, there has to be a board component to it too. And I can see, in many companies, it might be that there's a tremendous expertise at the executive level and the non-executives feel perhaps ill-qualified to actually question. And this is where, all board members need to come up to a level of confidence that they can ask the questions. And within Chapter Zero, we've, one of the things that we've created is a director's journey that any director, from whatever their background, can really start from the basics and work through step by step to give themselves the sort of, the comfort that they need to be asking the questions. And I think that's the importance that, yes, some boards probably will need very specific technical expertise, but every non-executive director should have a level of competence and comfort to actually be able to ask questions about climate change.
I think that's great. I guess Ali will make that link to that director's journey available after the call. One of the things I'm thinking about, Gillian, is about system thinking, because often when people are thinking about environmental things, they think about one bit of the chain. And actually, sometimes if you're working with other people, suppliers in particular, as Unilever has found, actually you can bring about system change. So some of the things around plastics have been because there's been system change. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the Chapter Zero work, how much do you think people are really thinking systems change as opposed to some element of the environmental chain? And we see this still with supermarket packaging. If you looked at that really systems thinking, you probably might change some things quite significantly.
Well, I think to a certain extent it's almost being forced upon us. I mean, you talked about supermarkets and supply chain, but I think also sort of reporting, because the way climate change is being reported and is not just looking at the entity, the narrow entity, but the ecosystem of suppliers and the broader impact. And so by definition, companies will have to take a stronger interest in what their suppliers are doing or how their customers are using their products. And I think actually climate change maybe it's a little bit circular, but will actually encourage us to think in a much more systemic way. I think the other piece, you mentioned plastics, and while we're talking about climate change, we are inevitably thinking about the environment more broadly, and biodiversity, for example. But I think, one of the things boards need to be very alert to is it's not clear where the pressure is going to come from. I mean, if you look at climate change, that David Attenborough's program, just you map the sort of share price of plastic manufacturers. And that single program, the first time it was aired, had a massive impact. And that's the sort of, while boards need to be thinking very long term, they also need to be very alert to these things can move very, very quickly. And hopefully that's something that COVID has taught us is that, we will need that agility to be able to respond extremely quickly. And it's not clear where the pressure is going to come from. It could well be consumers, might be government. And
suppliers. I mean, it's interesting, in the last 10 days, the awful cyclone in Bangladesh, the combination of global warming and sea levels rising is, there's various forecasts that 100 million people will need to move in a sort of 20-30 year period there. But in the last 10 days, 3 million people were displaced. It didn't make the news because we were preoccupied with other matters in the UK, but It did make the news, but not as prominent as you think that would be. But yeah, and that's disrupted. Apart from the terrible human tragedy of that, that's also disrupted supply chains for all sorts of things as a result. I think.
Sorry, Patrick, go on.
No, Karen.
I was just going to say, if we were being really, if we were being really candid here, and so, what this is government. We've had massive government intervention in a crisis which we can all see in the front of our face that's impacting us on a daily basis. Let's face it, climate change is still a major crisis. It's much bigger than the pandemic in its own right. What can we learn from the pandemic in terms of how we've responded, the speed of response? Because one of the things we know is we need to have responded faster, and yet somehow we seem to really struggle to keep the climate change agenda front of mind.
It's as much about response as it is about resilience. So if we continue to operate things at near maximum capacity with very complex sort of supply chain or system, then we're going to be less resilient when things come along like that. There's also having stuff in the cupboard. So in the UK we have this constant thing with the airport and snowplows. Is it really worth investing for the few days? And a bit like with masks and the pandemic or other things. I think we're just going to have to invest in a lot more things to make us more resilient to do that, and actually ways of working that will make us more resilient when the things happen. You can't anticipate everything or when or the scale of it, but I think you can have better contingency plans. We were caught hopping, really, weren't we, with COVID, and we should not be caught hopping with climate change. We've had plenty of warning on that.
Yeah.
Can I add that there may be something about the definition of value and how we articulate value and value generation. We have an economy that's very efficiency focused in the UK, and other economies perhaps are stronger on the resilience point that Patrick mentioned. And I think boards perhaps have a duty to be very clear that higher resilience probably means lower returns in the short term, and being able to have that conversation and make sure that sort of being articulated clearly. I think that's also a tremendously important point. And if I could just add, thinking the unthinkable. A number of boards did have pandemic as one of their highest risks on the risk register, and yet. And so I think, one of the things we can learn is that the unthinkable can happen, and we should all keep that sort of front of mind. And when we're working through risk registers and when we are sort of, working through the scenarios, hopefully this will give us a sense that it can happen. As Patrick said, you can't be prepared for every eventuality, but I think we've all been shaken out of any complacency that we might have had.
I think also there's something around money, and the simple thing that if you've got a decent amount of cash, you've got more optionality and you will be more resilient no matter what happens. And I've been discussing with a number of chairs in the charity sector around the perceived wisdom of you shouldn't really have too much in the way of unrestricted reserves, so free reserves that you can spend on what you like, because you should be spending that money on your beneficiaries. Absolutely. But what is the right balance? Because I think there's a number of charities at the moment who've been, really stretched and have very little choice over what they can do because they don't have sufficient unrestricted reserves. And the same is true of companies in terms of their balance sheets. If you're over leveraged, you've got nowhere to go when something bad happens. So I think there will be a period of, we need to rebuild reserves that we've been using up through this, as at the same time as catching up on investment and the easy expression of pivot to digital. Well, you need money to do that, and you need the right people to do that, and where's that going to come from? So I think there's going to be a big period of rebuild required as well, to rebuild resilience that we had before COVID, which we we feel generally wasn't enough. So I think that's quite a challenge.
What's your view, Patrick, on government intervention and Gillian around the climate change agenda? You know, we've had very strong government intervention in terms of action based, hopefully, on science. Should there be more of that? Do we need more of that to up the ante?
Well, I think there's certainly an opportunity. We've been talking about building back. And you know, the government is currently funding a large chunk of the economy, and may end up owning sort of substantial stakes in the economy. And there's certainly an opportunity to actually channel government support and align it to green initiatives. And you know, we've talked about electric vehicles, home insulation. You know, there's a number of sort of projects that could, sort of almost like infrastructure projects that could well support the green initiative. We also have COP26, which has been postponed a year, but that's also a real opportunity. It will be held in the UK for the UK government to really use that time to think through its stance and to work closely with business. I think one of the themes we touched upon before this webinar, but the relationship between business and government is going to be vital. And climate change is too big a problem for any sector or to solve on their own. And I think one of the things that boards probably do need to be working on is how to ensure that the voice of business is properly heard by government. Because we've seen how decisions can be taken very quickly, which may not reflect the business interest. And so that would be one of the things I'd also be having at the back of my mind is just making sure that the voice of business is properly understood in government.
Mm. And I guess, you know, another thing in the risk matrix to be thinking about now for boards is, you know, it's been shunted from the agenda, but the implications of Brexit are varied for different sectors. And a lot of boards are, you know, are getting their head back around that again at the moment as well.
So I'm just wondering if we could have a sort of final poll question around the climate change. How would you rate your board's level of climate change knowledge and competence? I think there is a general concern that the level of competence is not necessarily defined what that means, but people on the call will definitely have a view of how competent they feel and how competent the rest of their board members are. Whilst you're completing that, Patrick, we've had a lot of intensity over the last few weeks. You know, there's been a lot to learn, a lot of ambiguity coming ahead of us. Psychologically, I feel like we're entering into a dynamic where people are going to become more anxious again. You know, that there's a general sort of sense that anxiety levels are on the increase. There's also a sort of increase of frustration about people wanting to get back to work, but not necessarily being able to. What have you experienced with the boards that you're on and working with around how well they are able to deal with that?
I think that's at an individual and a collective level, I think. Sorry, the poll results just come in. I'm sure everyone's distracted by that, but most people think they're not very high or not at all really, only 11% high. Gillian, does that surprise you?
Well, I think probably humility is a good thing. I think it's a huge and daunting task. And one of the things I've noticed with Chapter Zero is I think if you're in a sector that's been affected by climate change for a long time, you probably do have an understanding, but there are many sectors which have only quite recently started to focus on this. And there I've seen quite a lot of sort of nervousness. I think this gap can be closed, as I hope I've made clear. You know, one doesn't need to sort of requalify and sort of take a science degree, and I think there's some really helpful frameworks out there. I hope Chapter Zero has provided access to a sort of a good range. It may feel very daunting, but I think closing that gap is not as daunting as it needs to be. And the role of the board is to be asking the questions and setting the direction. And I think that gap can be closed perhaps much more easily than people think from what was, as this poll would suggest.
Yeah,
thank you.
The Chapter Zero materials are really fantastic. So we'll send around the links to your toolkit and your website when we finish this, so that people can access that, and really encourage people to get involved. For non-execs, executives, the Chapter Zero forum is a really good one, really useful set of tools, and increasingly used and increasingly accessible. Patrick.
So yes, just going back then to the question of, how's it going to be? I think things are now going to be a lot harder for boards, as the decisions we've taken, most people will feel may have been sort of forced upon you. That's been sort of, you've had to do those things. Now these are the choices that we are making, and so therefore they're really, in a way, could be perceived as more of our decisions. We've done the obvious, the right, the natural thing, but now these are difficult choices. They're difficult judgments to make, because you're making a judgment about how quickly you think demand will reappear in your market, and all of your statistical models that you've had aren't really working now, because some of the key variables have sort of shifted, and so it'll take a while for that to get through. So you're making judgments around those things about, how many people you employ, what stocking you're going to have on things, when are you going to bring out those new products, when is that right pace. Also, I think because people will, I think the end of, well, not the end of furlough, but the stepping down of furlough, I think will mark, that will make a big difference, I think.
I think I'd be really mindful at the moment of actually capitalizing on this time. So as anxiety levels go up a bit, you also get an increase of energy, but also anxiety causes this sort of narrowing of vision. So I think was really important for boards at this particular moment is to capitalize on that increased energy, and to think very carefully about where their line of focus is, but also to really keep expanding those horizons. So some of these strategic conversations around building back better, this becomes a point in time when board directors can really earn their keep, by not being challenging necessarily just around monitoring, but really being challenging around keeping the eye on the big picture, keeping these conversations around environment, social and governance high on the agenda, thinking of optionality and inclusion. This is a time where these types of interventions become really quite important, I think.
Yeah. And perhaps if I may add, one of the things that I've observed, I mean, we work extensively internationally, and everybody has more time now, in the sense that they're not flying places, they're not traveling to places. And yes, I mean, there are burning issues and much to be dealt with, and working with Zoom can be very tiring. But actually, a lot of people do have more space, more time. And we are seeing that a number of board directors are actually using that time, for example, on the climate journey. I know a number who have actually just dedicated time to working through that. And so I'd absolutely sort of endorse what Ali's saying, use this time well, because it could be crucial for the for the years ahead.
Okay, so let's have some sort of thoughts from you, Patrick, about what next. Where would you be focusing your boards just now? What's next?
I think on those very important decisions of making some calls, but making sure we're resilient if we get them wrong, around the pickup of demand, around what are the capabilities that we really need for this next phase, all of that, and actually making sure that we don't get sloppy. So if we've tightened up around our practices in order to try and keep people safe, I think a worry I have is this sort of sudden, oh well, we're all right now, I think we're in that sort of moment where it's a bit too early to be doing that too quickly. So I think there's quite a desire for people to get back together again physically. I'm sort of picking that up amongst the organisations I'm working with, and people asking, well, will we be able to? And I think we just need to sort of be again measured about that, and focus on sales. At the end of the day, if you don't have any sales, you don't have any business. So which are the bits of the market that are going to recover most quickly? What are the products that will play best into those markets, and move from that? So I think that those basic commercial things don't go away. You have to do that. And also I think on preserving what's come out of it that's been really good. As I said on the last one, I think this sort of greater respect for people across an organisation has been a brilliant thing. And I think making sure we don't forget that, and keep building out the teamwork, the flexibility, all of those things. I think focusing on keeping the best of that and building upon that, and not just saying, well, we only needed that when it was pretty grim. We need it all the time.
Gillian, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think my final thoughts would be around not losing sight of the environmental threat, but also the opportunities there. There are real opportunities for business. And I think boards shouldn't be fearful about translating the sort of the higher level targets and vision, bringing it closer to home and starting. I mean, there's some real heavy lifting to be done, but actually starting to translate that into the strategy, the risk matrix, the KPIs. That's where the board really should take ownership and make sure that this big vision is actually being translated into how the company is being governed and run.
Yeah. Okay, so clearly we're saying that at this point in time, it is time for boards to really focus in the short term on the things that matter around what customers really want, using this time as a reframe, really focus on sales, innovation, action, a really important thing, but also be really mindful of these perhaps bigger strategic questions and building them into the day-to-day. I really feel like we've got an opportunity to capitalise on this sort of increased nervousness around getting back to work, but also this desire, people definitely have a desire to re-engage with each other in a physical way, but to re-engage with a new normal. So I want to just coming to the end of our webinar for today, and I want to thank Gillian very much, and for Chapter Zero for joining us today, and thank you again to Patrick as ever for your words of wisdom. And I'll just hand over to Lesley from Governance, who has hosted the webinar today.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thank you very much to all our speakers. That was absolutely fascinating as ever. One of the things I love about these webinars is how concentrating you are on the positives coming out of this and what's going to be good about coming out of the pandemic. And the lessons that we can learn, which I think is great. Thank you all to you for attending as well. We will be sending around an email probably on Tuesday next week. We'll put in the Chapter Zero links and what have you. And please, if there are any topics that you'd like us to cover for future webinars, please do get in touch with us. You can always reach us at info@governance.co.uk. And thank you very much to all of you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.